So I'm going to share 3 science facts with you. The first one is this. Out at Le Bourget, there's reputed to be 40,000 people, many of them scientists, or some of them scientists, and most of them are concerned about arguing about the last 150-year thermometer-measured temperature record. Now, 150 years in terms of climatic history is not even a heartbeat. In fact, 150 years is 5 climate data points. And to argue you want to reinterpret the world energy economy on the basis of 5 climate data points is just silly. But that's what these people are doing, and they are endlessly arguing angels on the head of a pin stuff about the details, such as, for example, whether there's been a pause for 18 years or not. That is climatically irrelevant. One climate data point is 30 years long. What happens over 16 years is, in a sense, irrelevant. To look at climate matters, you have to go to climate data sets. They are geological, and this is one of the most important. And in blue here, we have the temperature on the Greenland ice cap from an ice core in Greenland over the last 11,000 years there to today here. And what we see with the thin blue line is that over those 10,000 years, the climate has been cooling by about 2 degrees Celsius. So when one of the reporters in the back asks me, is global warming happening then, Bob? The answer is no, global warming is not happening. The long-term climate trend at the moment is one of cooling. Ah, but Bob, they say, what about that warming in the 20th century? What about that warming in the 20th century? There it is. It's that little warming there. Yes, it happened. And yes, it is part of a regularly oscillating climate up and down. Fred has just referred to this 1,500-year cycle of alternations between warm spikes and cold little ice age periods. We've just come out of the little ice age. It's not remotely surprising. It's entirely predictable that we're warming at the moment. But that is not an appropriate period of time over which to make judgments about climate policy. Well, I should stress this is not a global temperature curve. It's a temperature curve from Greenland, but I haven't picked it in any special way. I can show you similar curves from all around the world. Why don't I show you a global curve? Because there isn't one. You cannot simply reconstruct a global curve for the period 10,000 years ago. Well, I sometimes think in my big collection of slides, which is the single most important slide? If you were given one slide to use to contradict the conventional wisdom about global warming, which would you use? I'd use this one, partly for the reasons I just explained to you, but partly because of this. Here is carbon dioxide, as measured in the Antarctic ice core. Now, carbon dioxide mixes in the atmosphere within a year or so. So it's a global signal. And what we find is we have 2 degrees of cooling above the Greenland ice cap and similar cooling elsewhere. We have a 20 parts per million, that can't be right, rise in carbon dioxide. A rise in carbon dioxide, Greenpeace tells us, is going to fry the world. Well, it didn't, and it won't. So this is one diagram. It's all you need to, as Fred says, support the null hypothesis, which is that the changes we observe today in here are simply part of natural variation. This data is consistent with that, and there is no single piece of data which is inconsistent with that. So it's a myth. It's not just my opinion that modern temperatures are unusually high. They're not at all unusually high. They're actually quite cool at the moment, though within an overall warmer period. It's a myth that adding more carbon dioxide to the present concentration will cause measurable temperature rise. There's the evidence. Now, I'll come back to this bit in yellow here, present concentration of 400 parts per million. That's important and is normally not considered. Okay, my second science facts point is this slide, which is a longer period of time now, 500 million years ago. And here in this period, CM stands for Cambrian, is when the first Metazoan explosion took place in the evolution and diversification of life. And more importantly, it's when many different groups of marine organisms got little hard parts, little shrimps, little shellfish and things like that. And what we see is that measuring carbon dioxide in the deep past is a tricky thing to do. There's a lot of different ways to do it. They have big error bars. But overall, there's no doubt whatsoever, plotting all the data on one diagram, that carbon dioxide levels were much higher back here in the Cambrian than they were here today, and that the trend in between is definitely a diminishing trend. So how much higher were they in the Cambrian? Well, here's the scale. Number of times the Quaternary average, which is that point there, 5 times 10, 15 times modern levels. Furthermore, that equates to 4,000 parts per million, whereas before the Industrial Revolution down here, we were at 280 parts per million. And let me stress that if Greenpeace is right, if we just double carbon dioxide, the oceans are going to boil away. Well, in fact, this is 15 times the carbon dioxide. The oceans didn't boil away. Their chemistry is similar to the modern ocean, and the basic physiology of the organisms that we find the fossils of are the same organisms living on today's beaches and shallow marine continental shelves. This little red spot, there's 1,000 and 0, so you can read the bottom of it as 280 parts per million. That was before the Industrial Revolution. We've now put in extra carbon dioxide and we're at 400 parts per million, which you can say is in the middle. And if we double it, we would go to 560 parts per million, which is the top. So that red spot encapsulates the recent past and the likely near future. 280 parts per million, even 390 or 560 indicates carbon dioxide starvation compared with the geological past. And as Fred has said, these are well below optimum levels for plant growth, which is why commercial tomato growers put 1,000 parts per million of carbon dioxide in their greenhouses. Why? Does it make them feel better? No, it makes the plants feel better, and furthermore they use water more efficiently, which is wonderful for a country like Australia or Israel that has arid zone agriculture problems. So it's a myth. It's a myth that's taught to your children and grandchildren in every school class they go into, and it's a disgrace that atmospheric carbon dioxide is at unusually high levels today. It is actually at starvation levels. The third science fact is this one, and I come back to my point about it depends upon the concentration, the absolute concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as to how powerful a greenhouse gas it is. This is a plot, and you will see that's 20 parts per million of carbon dioxide, that's another 20, another 20, another 20. So adding 20 parts per million increments to a planet, or to Earth's planet, and working out the warming effect, the first 20 parts per million has a warming of 1.5 degrees. That's a really powerful greenhouse gas. So at very low concentrations, carbon dioxide is indeed a powerful greenhouse gas. But then you take the next 20 parts per million and you just get 0.3 and then 0.15 or something like that. So you get 2 degrees of warming in here for this first little part, and then this negative logarithmic curve tails off parallel to the axis of infinity, and you can see that you just add increments and you get very little additional warming. Now we're not here. So we're in a glacial period, 180 parts per million, that was 20,000 years ago. Pre-industrial revolution, we're at 280 parts per million. Today, we're at 400 parts per million. And should we double, we will add all these little, very small incremental warmings, and that's the amount of warming left, about 0.4 degrees, should we proceed to full doubling by 560 degrees. 0.4 degrees, would you notice? If you go to the top of the Eiffel Tower observation platform, that is 1.8 degrees cooler than at ground level. Do you see tourists coming down and stripping off their clothes because it's so hot when they get to the bottom? Do you even notice a 2 degree change in every day walking around? No, you don't. So 0.4 degrees is trivial. It's a myth that more carbon dioxide will cause dangerous or even any measurable warming. But it's not a myth that it's a greenhouse gas. Yes, it is a greenhouse gas. But it's just at this particular point on the decreasing logarithmic curve, adding more produces very little incremental warming, and furthermore, more and more is incrementally less and less warming. That is why there will not be dangerous global warming produced by carbon dioxide. My fourth science fact is this one. Some nice work done by some people in CSIRO in Australia a couple of years ago. It's a map of the world coded for the increased plant growth productivity between 1982 and 2010 as measured from satellites, and they predicted that the satellite data agreed, showing an 11% increase in foliage after adjusting for precipitation. And that's due to the carbon dioxide fertilisation effect. And note that that increase, the darker colours, are along the sides of the major deserts, right where you'd want to get more greening. In other words, you're expanding the area of vegetated land. Whoops, what happened there? So it's a myth. Again, your children are taught, and grandchildren, exactly the opposite in all their school lessons, but it's a myth that increasing atmospheric carbon dioxide is an environmental hazard. It's actually an environmental benefit. It greens the planet. And it helps grow tomatoes. Right, this is, I was tempted to label this another final science point, but it's not. It's my final detailed slide. But it's modelling that was done before the Copenhagen conference. And so it cuts off here in 2009. And these solid lines were the emissions of carbon dioxide by respectively the whole world, by the undeveloped countries, by the developed countries, and by the US in blue at the bottom. Now presuming, and we all know this didn't happen, presuming that the measures they had on the table at Copenhagen were implemented, then this is the model track. The US would decline like this, the other OECD countries would decline like that, Brazil, China, India and other developing countries would do that, the total would do that. Not only have the IPCC got the science wrong, they've got the economics and politics wrong. It is absurd to suggest that any conceivable cuts by the developed countries will make any difference to a global total that is dominated by this curve. Myth. Again, this whole thing basically proceeds in myths. What's even more worrying is that the entire newspaper industry seems to be determined to reinforce those myths, day in, day out. It's a myth that cutting Western carbon dioxide emissions will make any measurable difference to future temperatures. It won't make any difference. It'll do a lot of damage to our economies, but it's not going to make any difference to global temperature. So why does the NIPCC matter, Non-Governmental International Panel on Climate Change, which Fred Singer was the creator of, and I applaud you for that, Fred, and which Heartland have taken over as the publisher of? Well, this is what a critic wrote in response to the first volume of the most recent report. It's the best and most comprehensive source of alternative scientific views. Any speaker, any authority, any journalist or bureaucrat asserting catastrophic danger of man-caused global warming needs to be asked for their response to this report. If they have none, they are not qualified to address the subject. I have not seen the report referred to in any mainstream media anywhere in the world since it was published. There's various reports in other places, but not in the big papers like the New York Times and so on and so forth. So that's Volume 1, Physical Science. Volume 2 is Biological Impacts. Volume 3 is going to be the benefits and costs of fossil fuels. It's on the way. You have on the table in front of you an extract and summary of the first 2 chapters out of this, and this concentrates on the scientific method, the business of the null hypothesis, why the 97% figure is not just wrong, it's absurd and it's deceitful, and why consensus has nothing to do with science. So that's in that little booklet, but I stress it's only the first part of what will be a 3rd volume in this series. And in general, we can draw 6 important conclusions from the NIPCC report. The assumption that prior to the Industrial Revolution the Earth had a more stable climate is just wrong. Climate's always changed, it always will. Fred stressed this. There's nothing unusual about modern magnitudes or rates of change of temperature, ice volume, sea level, extreme weather events, or the quality of coffee beans, which was the latest story running in the media 2 days ago. The most likely medium-term threat may be of damaging cooling. That's the little ice age that Fred referred to. Many solar astrophysicists think that's a very distinct possibility. Atmospheric carbon dioxide is neither a pollutant nor primary forcing agent for temperature change. Rather, carbon dioxide greens the planet and is an overall benefit. Attempting to stop climate change is an expensive act of utter futility. Have you ever heard a politician say they're going to stop this earthquake? They're going to stop that volcanic eruption? You'd laugh them out of the room.